Broadcasting from Orchard Park, New York,
and Boca Raton, Florida,
it's the Freight 360 podcast. From freight broker sales tips to sports talk, this podcast is all about helping you grow as a freight broker. We're your hosts, Nate Cross
and Benjamin Kowalski.
Let's talk freight. All right, special episode for you guys. Merry Christmas, first of all. We're coming up on the holiday, the biggest holiday of the year for spending and shipping and all that stuff, and a new year in general. But today we're going to talk about something controversial, and that's going to be broker margins. But we'll get there in just a second. If you're brand new, great episode. Make sure to check out every other episode we got. We're going to reference some old material today as well. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share, every little button and thing you can find that helps get us in front of you every week and in front of more people via the algorithm. And keep sending us your questions through YouTube comments, email, website, all that good stuff. And if you'd like to learn more about our training or coaching, check us out online at freight360.net and check out the Freight Broker Basics course to learn more about how to be the best broker you can be. This episode is brought to you by Blue Book Services. Blue Book Services is the resource you need if you're transporting fresh produce. Their online database contains thousands of companies throughout the produce industry supply chain. You can easily search their database to generate new sales leads. Blue Book's credit ratings help you avoid companies with high credit risk, and their team can help resolve disputed loads. To learn more, go to producebluebook.com and click join today. That's producebluebook.com. I actually was in Tennessee last week, had an agent in town, and was talking with her about Produce Blue Book and how to generate leads. She had never used it before, so I was playing around in there last week. It's really, really cool. There's a ton of data in there, and it's almost like, Ben, how we talk about if you don't know where to start with prospecting because there's just so many things like commodities.
Yep.
Produce is the same way. When you see like how many different commodities are in there, it's wild. But anyway, man, how you doing?
Doing well. Got some nice Christmas weather down here. Excited to have a little bit of a lighter week next week.
Define South Florida Christmas weather.
Low was 57 yesterday. So, I had long sleeve shirt, hoodie, and sweatpants on. That's about the warmest clothes I'm going to put on all year. So,
I gotcha.
Chilly.
That's fair. But, It was kind of mild recently, just all around the country. Like we had here in Orchard Park, we had no snow on the ground until just a couple days ago. For like the previous couple of weeks, it was like in the 50s. It was even like 60 degrees, rain. So like all the snow we had gotten went away, and we've got, I don't know, a couple inches right now that came in from a weather pattern earlier this week. But we'll have a white Christmas, it looks like, so that's cool. Nice. Kids can build a snowman and all that good stuff. Sports, man, Bills Mafia quickly went from, oh man, we're gonna be out of the playoffs to Super Bowl, baby. Like that's how ruthless my fan base is in this city. Is they? Well, I shouldn't say they. It's we, because I would affiliate myself with them. We're very like elastic when it comes to our emotions around Buffalo sports.
It's a roller coaster.
Yeah. But you look at it, like we went from, there's a really cool tool. So obviously ESPN has like their playoff machine, but the New York Times has an interactive tool to play around with playoff odds for each team. And the Bills went from possibly being a single digit playoff contender, like 6% chance of playoffs, to like 80% by beating two really good teams. And now all of a sudden it's like, hey man, we're only 2 games behind Miami. We've got 2, I don't want to call them layup games ahead of us, but the Chargers and the Patriots, who should, like, we're dealing with basically backup offenses and teams that are eliminated and don't really care. You've got an interim head coach in LA, backup quarterback, players that are veterans of the league and really don't care to get injured or do anything when they have no hopes for the playoffs. So I don't want to call them layup games, but they should be easily manageable games for the Bills, whereas Miami's got the Cowboys and the Baltimore Ravens the next 2 weeks, 2 very difficult games, and the culmination, week 18, is the Bills against the Dolphins, and the Bills could take the division if Miami drops one of those games and the Bills march on the next 2 weeks. So we'll see. This is like the whole time of year when it's really exciting, and guys like me get super nerdy on what, all the maths and stuff looks like and where the cards might land come January. So yeah, and what sucks, and then I'll get off my NFL rant, is I've been so I go to drill for the National Guard once a month, and I have not missed a single game all year. Just the way that the games have fallen until freaking week 18, I'm going to be at drill 5 hours away when the Bills are going to be playing Miami. So I'm still trying to like figure out how to fake COVID or something like that. But yeah, it's going to suck. I'll be like listening in my car or watching as I'm driving illegally or something like that. But anyway, go Bills. I'm so excited, man. Ben, what do we got? Anything else around the world of sports?
No, and the Steelers took a horrible loss after it was like the best first half that they've had all year. I was like super fired up. I actually got to watch the game, and then they shit the bed.
Are they 7-7 now?
I don't know if they're 500 or not.
I think they're 7-7. Yeah, because
they lost the last three, and they were
7-4.
Yep.
Yeah.
And to your point earlier, right? Like Steelers have always had a history of playing poorly to poor teams and up to better teams. And against the Cardinals and it was the Cardinals and the Patriots, right? 2-win teams. 2 consecutive losses and do not look great heading into the last stretch of the year.
Yeah, and it's all about the timing, man. If you start hot as one thing, but if you cool down, no bueno. Whereas if you are mediocre and then you heat up at the right time, that's what really matters. You know what I mean?
I don't think either of those were the case for the Steelers. They were really hot. They were kind of winning against all odds and screeching around 500 again. Ugly wins, but win's a win. And
yeah, W's a W. So we'll see, man. We'll see. News. What do we got? What did we put out in the newsletter yesterday? Anything fun and exciting? It's not like there's the owner of Nikola, the electric trucks, I want to say, fraud guy. You can read about that. He's the founder. Thank you, producer Steven in the background there for that. Convoy layoffs. No, Coyote is what you mean. Yep. Coyote's got voluntary layoffs. Did you see that, Ben?
I didn't.
What's like their fourth round of layoffs this year, but they're making them voluntary. They're like basically telling people, we'll give you a separation package type deal. So who knows?
Well, that's nice of them.
Did you ever give Paul over at Freight Caviar your take on the freight market?
I have not yet. He needs that by tomorrow, I think, right?
Yeah. Today's Wednesday as we record, but he wanted to know by Thursday. I gave him mine. It was interesting because we talked about mine in a nutshell was with companies going out of business, both brokers and carriers, the supply-demand curve is heading to correct itself back to a normalcy. But I think it's going to be slow unless we've got some extreme outside pressures or influences from like interest rates or the Fed. So, but yeah, man,
looks to be heading in a positive direction.
Out of business is like normal course correction for the market. So
for sure, it's part of it.
That's that's the news. Let's shout out DAT, and we're gonna get into controversy.
Tired of struggling to find accurate rates and the right carriers for your freight? With DAT1, you can access more than 500 million posted loads and trucks every year. That's 3 times more capacity than any other load board. Plus, their integrated freight management system makes it easy to cover loads 24/7. They have the most trusted network of carriers, brokers, and shippers in the industry. You'll get real-time rates on every lane, so you know exactly how much a shipment will cost before you commit to it. Plus, you get instant access to top bids from qualified carriers around the country. Get 10% off first year of DAT1 with a link in the show notes.
Absolutely. All right. So if you've been part of the Freight X space lately, which is basically Freight Twitter, it's been interesting, especially things seem to boil the last few days and week. And it's been, we've been hearing this for a long time. Carriers and brokers, there's at odds with each other. There's some animosity. And again, I really think that these are mostly outliers, right? You get the super loud, annoying people on both sides that are calling the other one, fraudsters and bad and whatnot. And the discussion of rate transparency and, the whole TQL got raided by the FMCSA, which clearly came out to be non-substantiated story from the woman that said that whole thing. It was a virtual investigation. But anyway, we're going to talk about margins today. And I've talked about this, even Ben, before you and I did this, like in the infancy, when this was like the midnight freight broker back in 2019. I remember having an episode where I talked about margins, and the data came from FreightWaves. A lot of the data we're going to talk about today comes from DAT, and we've had Ken Adamo on. We had Tamir Dove on from DAT as well. And the data they have is it's a massive data set. It's sifted through. We're going to kind of regurgitate some of that. Make sure to check out episode, was it 207? We had Tamir on earlier this year, where he really breaks down the origin of when you go into RateView or RateCast, it's giving you the origin of how that data becomes what you see on your screen.
Yep.
Okay. So I guess to open up the discussion here, what have you, have you been checking out some of this stuff on Twitter or Facebook or anything where people are going back and forth? Have you seen any of it?
I didn't at all until you guys were sending around all this stuff. I think in like the middle of the night, because I was at like 6 o'clock this morning. I was sitting there having coffee and I was reading through all of this. And my wife's like, "What is so funny?" I'm like laughing hysterically. And she's like, "Who are you talking to?" I'm like, "I'm not talking to anybody." She's like, "Well, what's so funny?" I'm like, I can't stop laughing. I'm just like, I guess this is what the internet is anymore. I'm like, I spend zero time watching people argue with each other. And it was pretty comical because like, there's like a kernel or like a kernel of truth in some of even the most outlandish things, right? Which I think gives people the leg to stand on as if like they're justified. Yeah. But the reality is like the conclusions they're coming to based on like this 2 or 3% of truth, right, are just completely unfounded, make literal no sense as it relates to economics, free markets, or just what is known about how economics functions. Like just literally the conclusions make no sense, even though it's founded in a little bit of truth and mostly just people wanting to blame someone else other than themselves for the situations they're in, is my overall take.
Precisely. So to kind of start it off, Ken Adamo, he's a chief analyst. I might have butchered his title, but he's like super smart analyst guy over at DAT. We've had him on the show numerous times. We'll get him on again soon. He's gotten, apparently, like he discovered Twitter in the last month, and I'm so glad he did because he's such a comical troll / entertainer when it comes to the stuff he posts. But it's entertaining, right? So he had posted a statistic that showed data from November 2023 on average margins for specifically it was like van long haul loads. And it put, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it put the margin somewhere around like, I don't know, 14%. And very quickly everyone's like, well, that's not true because the FMCSA rated TQL and found out that there's 50,000 million% margins, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, all right. Clearly people just believe whatever they hear from a fake report. But Ken's a credible source. DAT's got a lot of credible data. And in today's episode, I'm going to talk through some of my personal experiences, what I tend to see for margins and how that fluctuates throughout the year. We're talking about percentages, dollar amount per load, full truck versus LTL. And then I'll share with you guys the largest margin and the smallest margin. So, and these are going to be estimates, but yeah, man. So this goes on and there's back and forth. And so before we got on air, I wanted you to save this, but you were saying there is something that was brought to light in this whole conversation that you think is worthy, or it's got some merit to it. So take me through that thought, because I don't even know what it is, but I'm curious. What is the argument that came out on the other side opposing that say, hey, these margins are only 14%? That's not true. What is the other side of this that you think we should be looking at?
Here's the one piece that I think was somewhat merited, but again, the conclusions, and I'm trying to find the exact one because it's from The SBTC, who our producer found an interesting article about the person behind this, which I thought was even more comical. Before I even started to read this, I got the backstory, which
we're not going to trash him. We invited him on the show,
exactly.
So we'll give him a couple weeks to come on the show, and if not, then we'll give the whole scoop on him.
But in there, basically, what they were saying is, hey, look, DAT, gets all of this data from all the major carriers across the country, and then imports that to create market data, right?
Yep.
Now, the argument is, well, he had said, economies of scale. These larger trucking companies, right, have better purchasing power, which allows them to have lower costs for fuel, maintenance, tires, and the like, which is true.
Say that again.
And I went and spent about 20 minutes going back and looking at the definitions of economies of scale and to see what it affects. The claim is that larger carriers have economies of scale because they have lower cost for fuel and maintenance and some tires because they can buy in bulk, right? Now, the reality is like, that is true. The more things you buy, the more of a discount you will have to possibly tires or fuel. The reality, though, is the percentage of your overall cost to run a trucking company, those are by far the smallest percentage in operating costs, right? Your biggest aspect of operating costs, right, are going to be, it's fuel, but your percentage discount's negligible. It's the truck, it's the insurance, right? It's the driver, it's your fixed cost related to it. So like our industry always kind of jokes that you don't really get economies of scale in trucking companies because like in manufacturing, if you build a plant, it gets cheaper to keep making widgets, right? The more widgets you can make. But a truck can only drive so many miles with so many loads and so many pounds on it every week, and you can't get any more out of it. So you always have to increase your fixed costs to scale a trucking company. You got to buy another truck, hire another driver. You can't just double the freight on one truck the way manufacturing can and other industries. So that's the common conception, or I would say belief about our industry, is like, that's why the biggest companies don't control all the market. And almost every other industry, companies like Microsoft and these things, like literally can own the market in some ways because of economies of scale. Trucking companies have never really been able to do that for this very fundamental reason. Like if you have 1,000 trucks or 3,000 trucks, if you want to grow, you still need more trucks and more drivers, right? Like you can't just move more freight with the same number of fixed costs. So that's what Ken was really arguing. It's like, look, it's true, but it's nowhere near as impactful as he's making it out to be, right? Is the first piece. But okay.
No, go ahead. You're good.
Where he goes from there, though, is that, well, DAT only takes data from the biggest carriers who can afford to run loads for lower rates. Okay. I mean, more larger carriers are sharing data because they have more of it than the smaller carriers. I'd say that's definitely true, right? And then he argues, though, that brokers are not willing to pay smaller carriers more money because they point to DAT to tell them where the market is. So in the conclusion, after saying all that, he says, well, a broker works with a smaller carrier and goes, well, look, I can pay $1.75 a mile because that's what DAT says the average is. And his point is, well, smaller carriers have higher operating costs that don't get rolled into that average, right? And he's like, so it's not a fair comparison. The reality is like, what determines a rate between a broker and a carrier isn't DAT. It's a carrier's willingness to run it. They don't have to. It's not, and this is what I said, is like, just because the averages have more to do with the larger companies than the smaller ones, doesn't mean the smaller companies have to accept loads for what is being offered, which is the leap they make after that makes no sense because it's an open market. It's free. Nobody's regulated to take anything. Nobody has to take anything they don't want to. They take it based on whether or not they have an opportunity cost. Is there a better load out there or not? If there's not, they've got to take it. It has nothing to do with what the averages are reported.
Exactly. And I want to point out something else on economies of scale. There's almost a negative economy of scale with brokers and carriers as you get large. And I talked about this. I talked to a bunch of students at a local college a couple weeks ago about this. And one kid asked, like, why don't these big trucking companies go out there and haul stuff for cheaper? Because, they're so big, can't they afford to? And I said, well, actually, I'm like, what does a big trucking company have to pay for that a small owner operator doesn't? He's like, I don't know. And I'm like, janitors, HR people, attorneys, The list goes on and on and on. And the same goes for brokerage, right? The larger brokerages that are out there sustain because they pay their brokers less, right?
Yes.
They have lower paid brokers, therefore they have enough earnings for the company to pay
Reinvest.
for HR, legal, buildings, right? Like all of that stuff. Executives, management, right? And you're going to see that in your mega carriers as well. So they actually have more expenses. The difference is if you're a broker at TQL, where they pay you I'm making these numbers up, 40 grand a year and 20% margin, you're willing to do that because they're going to train you up out of college on how to do this job. Whereas if you're a truck driver, you're doing the same job no matter what, whether you're an owner-operator or you're working for a big fleet. It might be a difference in dispatch and whatnot, but you don't have to learn the sales and prospecting process that brokers have to learn, and not just learn, but like actually be able to do successfully to succeed in brokerage. We don't just go to a load board and get loads. We have to build relationships with customers who are willing to pay us to move their freight. Sometimes at a gain and sometimes at a loss. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here.
I'll go even further than that, right? The trucking companies that are owned or managed by folks that learn what you just pointed out have a competitive advantage over the ones that don't. So the motor carriers that get more effective and get better at building relationships with shippers directly, right, tend to have higher contract rates, tend to have more consistency in volume, and tend not to go up and down as much as the smaller carriers. The smaller carriers that, to your point, don't have the relationships because either they don't have the information or the ability to do that or the time or whatever it is, right, tend to be more reliant on the spot market. And the spot market is more volatile, like every other market in the world, whether you're buying tulips, stocks, anything, any pork bellies, they're all the same, right? Like the more you rely on the spot market, buying and trading every day, the more you win when it goes up and the more you lose when it goes down. Which ironically is why you don't see any of these arguments happening when the market was high, because they were killing it and reaping rewards. When the spot market's low, then everybody screams that it's not my fault, it's the market and everyone else. Where I would say, better positioned and better managed trucking companies don't ride the ups and downs as much. They have more consistency across the year. They have more contracts because they build better relationships over longer periods of time with the shippers directly. And they don't rely on the brokers as much, which is why you don't hear them screaming, because they're not dependent. They use them, but they don't rely on them to pay their bills.
Legitimately. So like the brokerage I work for, we have a trucking company as well. And I know a lot of brokerages out there operate this way, where they've got a fleet of trucks and a brokerage. And I will tell you that it is the goal of our asset side to never take a load from an outside brokerage. But sometimes we have to, right? Because there's not a perfect world in which we have a relationship in every little random city that we might end up in for a backhaul, right? We've got our own direct customers for the trucking company, and we've got our brokerage customers that we can load on our company trucks. But every now and then, we're taking a load from TQL or C.H. Robinson or fill in the blank brokerage because they have a valuable relationship that we don't. And we're going to rely on that to get our trucks repositioned back to our fleet so that our preventative maintenance and all that stuff can get done and our drivers can reset at home or wherever, at the shop.
For sure.
So what I want to read one of the SBTC, right, that you had mentioned, the Small Business and Transportation Coalition. One of the things, and I believe it's James Lamb is actually
James Lamb.
He's the one that's he's the thumbs behind the tweet. He was arguing with Ken Adamo, and I'm going to read what he said in a portion of it. And then I just replied and I said, this is just not true. And I'm going to explain why. So he said, this is about what portion of a load a broker keeps and a carrier receives on average for the 3PL industry, blah, 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 blah. He said in at least one instance, the data shows broker commissions above and beyond 16% industry margin averages purported by TIA in 2020. Why these profit margins are calculated for release to investors, blah, blah, blah. Okay, here it goes. He goes, if I'm correct, just looking at profit margins on a load that paid the broker $1,000 with only, say, a 50-50 agent commission. So here, I won't read the whole thing. His argument is that the data being reported is the actual commission paid to the broker versus the gross margin on the load. So the example was like, all right, let's say you made $1,000 profit on a load and That represents a 30% margin. Well, if only 50% is paid to the agent, then they're going to only report a 15% margin. That's not true. That is not the data that DAT gets,
yes.
right? And he further went on to say that, like, if it's paid to someone who's got or has a lesser commission, right, it's going to further deflate the reported margin. That is just not the case, right? And again, episode 207, Tamir Dovzan from DAT, he breaks it down. They've got, and again, there's other companies that do this too. FreightWaves has Sonar. Truckstop has RateMate. Okay, RateView from DAT. They've got a co-op of a bunch of shippers. There's Ken broke it down, like shippers, brokers, carriers, whatever. Right? They've got a bunch of them that submit their data in different ways. Sometimes it's through an API. Daily, weekly. Sometimes they submit a spreadsheet. It's all depending on their relationship and preference. DAT takes this data, and these are your actual rates, right? Shipper pays broker, broker pays carrier, right? We know that we're not talking about how much commission was paid, how much was paid to factoring if that was included, just straight up gross profit, GP, right? And then what they'll do is they'll take out any outliers, right? If it's below a certain dollar amount, if it's not relevant, such as air freight or RAL, and then you've got your data set. From there, they're going to exclude, I believe it was like the outlying, like 3 standard deviations out above and below. So now you've got your 2 standard deviations. So you've got like over 90% of the data is intact. From there, what you'll see on, and you've got to have certain amount of reports by certain number of different parties for that data to actually be represented on DAT. Otherwise, it won't be part of that. That specific.
Here's Ken's answer to that, because he outlined these. What are the revenue ranges of the shippers that are included? Current contributors range from less than 50 million of freight to over $1 billion annually. They said, and then the other question that you asked was, you covered it. That's what's included. And it said, are all loads given as data points? It says, we only take in data that can be used within our current suite of products. Right now, that's North American truckload, intermodal, and LTL. So that's what's included, right? To your point.
Yep. And then lastly, what you actually see on RateView is the 25th to the 75th percentile. And Tamir explains this way better than I will. That line in the middle is your 50th. The line on top and the line on bottom are your 25th and 75th. Does that mean that all data falls within there? No. Does it mean that the vast majority does? Yes. Can there be outliers? Yes. Is a backhaul going to cost less than a front haul that includes 200-mile deadhead? Yes. Are both of those valid data points to be included? Yes. There is a ton of variety that goes into here. So, like, to try and say that like everything falls into one spectrum or that one rule applies to all arguments here is just false. There is simple. This is an industry where people agree, like you said before, DAT does not control the rates. A carrier agrees to haul a load at a certain rate. Whether that rate is given by a shipper or that load is given by a broker does not make a difference. Whatever they're willing to take it for, that's the market rate at that specific time. The other thing I wanted to say in here, and then I'll stop. I'll take a breath because I'm probably turning red over here. But carriers are very upset. Okay, I'm generalizing this. There are certain carriers that are very upset that brokers have the margins that we have sometimes. When the reality is, we're not the only expense or thing that's chiseling away at their bottom line dollar. Okay, if you have breakdowns because you poorly maintain your equipment, that's on you. That's not on a freight broker. Okay, if you have time out of service because your driver was speeding or got in an accident, that is not the broker's fault. That is your fault. If you're getting overcharged for your insurance or for your membership to fill in the blank, that is not the broker's fault. That is your fault. If you have 8% note on your truck lease, that is your fault, not the broker's fault. If you've got 3% factoring fees, that is your fault, not a broker's fault. Okay. At the end of the day, we are one thing that is a potentially a cost to a carrier. And in my opinion, if I'm an owner operator, I would rather take a decent paying load and have a broker make 15% margin than me have to waste 3 hours trying to find some load on a load board that may or may not actually exist, or even better yet, trying to call a shipper and then, having to deal with them undercutting me or, beating me down in price. So I'd rather pay a broker 15%, or I shouldn't say pay. I'd rather a broker make 15% margin for me to get a good paying load that gets me where I want to go than try to go out there myself and sell to a direct shipper when I don't have any knowledge of how to do so. And that's the value that we bring in. Not to mention we're the bank. We're floating them money on average like 3 to 4 weeks if you look at the data there. So that's my rant overall. We'll take a break and give a shout out to our friends over at Lean Solutions Group. Is your freight brokerage hiring? You've got to check out Lean Solutions Group, the industry leader in nearshore staffing for logistics companies with offices in South America, Mexico, and the Philippines. They offer a wide range of roles from back office operations to web development and marketing. Partner with the best. Visit www.leangroup.com to learn more. All right, Ben, what do you got?
All right. So, I think I want to boil that down into even more simply, right? Like, nobody's responsible for anyone's operating costs or how they manage their business except the people that own it and manage it. Full stop, right? That responsibility does not go outside of whoever those people are, whether it's one person in one truck or 100 people in 500 trucks, whatever that number is. Whoever's making the decisions for what happens to the money comes in, whether it gets spent, distributed, or reinvested in the business, all happens within inside that business, right? What I want to make sure we don't make this correlation or this jump is that has anything to do with what somebody's going to pay you for your services. They don't have anything to do with each other, right? Like if I go to any small town and I go to a bread maker, I don't ask them what their operating costs are. I look for the quality of the product. Hey, can I get the same thing here as I can get across the street? If it's the same thing, what's the next thing that matters to me? Price. I'm going to go with the cheaper one, right? I don't care if they've got 5 ovens, a lot of debt, and all these bills they pay, and they don't clean up or do anything else, right? I care if the quality is the same. What do I look at next, right? In an efficient market, people that are purchasing things look for the things of value, right? Not just what it costs, what is the service, what is the reliability, right? All those things factor into what you pay for a truck, right? What never factors in is how they're managing their finances. The people purchasing those services don't get that information, and we don't need it. And it works both ways. In the same way that somebody says our margins should be justified in one thing or another, has no idea what that money goes to be used for, right? Whether it's to hire people, whether it's just myself, whether it's to hire a bunch of salespeople that don't work out and I'm not profitable because I made that decision, doesn't mean I can charge any more or any less, right? Whatever you can charge has nothing to do with what it costs you to run that business. And this is, to me, a very big example of everybody wanting to blame the revenue and the fact that they can't make money with what they're getting as if those two things had anything to do with each other, right? And that, to me, is the part that is really frustrating. Because even going back a second, and that's what I said to that one post, I said, well, let's just accept what you're saying is true. And let's just say if all of those numbers were there, or even furthermore, let's say you get rid of all the big carriers and you just put all of the rates of the small carriers in there, right? And now we see numbers that would look different, right? And to his point, the smaller carriers are getting paid less or should be getting paid more, right? It doesn't matter if that average, the DAT or any market, somebody's showing these rates to the market, if it's $1.50 or $2.50 a mile, right? Doesn't really matter if one, you don't trust it and it's not true, right? Which is the first point. Which is why DAT spends so much time doing this. Because if it isn't true, it's not to their benefit and people stop using it. Full stop, right? So there is no motive for a company to not put out information that is usable is the first thing. It's against their best interest. Second of all, whether a rate is $1.20 a mile on DAT or $2.50 a mile today, it's not like a carrier calls me and goes, hey, what are you paying on this load? And I go, well, DAT says it's $1.30, so you have to take it for $1.30. That's just my offer. The carrier then is going to look at everybody else's offer that day. They'll look at the load board, they'll call a bunch of brokers and go, hey, I need to get from Atlanta to Chicago. Broker 1 wants to pay me $2,000. Broker 2 wants to pay me $1,950. Broker 3 wants to pay me $2,050. If all the loads are the same, meaning loading time, unloading, transit, and weight,
which is unrealistic to begin with, but let's say they're all
the same. A carrier is going to play every broker against each other if he can to get the best rate. And in a scenario where there's 3 loads in one truck, that carrier will get all three of those brokers to keep upping their rate until that one truck takes it. And that happens every day, all of the time, in a market where there's more freight than there are trucks, meaning there's more demand for a truck than there are trucks to provide it. So guess what the rate does? It goes up.
Up and up and up. Yep.
Regardless, if that rate on DAT shows me $3 a mile, right? But there's one load and there's 5 trucks that want that load to get from LA to Chicago, guess where that rate's going to go? First carrier calls me and goes, I want 25. The second carrier calls me, I'm going to go, can you do it for 24? He's going to go, yeah, but the average is $3,000. I'm like, yeah, but I got a guy before you said I'll do it for 25. Do you want it? Yeah, we'll do 24. And then the third guy, I'm going to go, well, I got a $2,400 option. Do you want to take it for 23? And I will do that to all 3 or 4 of them until I get the one that needs it the most, that is willing to take it for the amount that I want to pay.
That is just
what drives it down.
That is supply and demand right there.
That's it. Nobody's having in this conversation, hey, I'm going to pay you more because the market says this. And nobody in there is saying, oh, I'm sorry, you bought your truck at the peak of market prices and your truck payment is twice as much as the next guy I talked to. I'm going to pay you more of my money because you made a poor decision. Like, I don't care. Nobody should care. That's not an efficient market. That's not capitalism. That doesn't have anything to do with how the market functions, right? But when you muddy the water and make it seem like your poor decisions have anything to do with what you're able to charge for your services, it's just misleading everybody as to who's actually responsible for the decisions that they make when they're actually managing their businesses, which doesn't help them either. Just gives them somebody to be angry at. And at the end of the day, they keep making the same decisions and they're going to end up in the same place, right? Either without a company or having to find something else to do. And to me, they're not the same. They're not even closely related. But in a way that makes everybody feel better, it's like, well, I guess it's not my fault that I bought a bunch of trucks at the peak because I was greedy and wanted to capitalize on the peak of the market and I thought it would last forever. Why should anybody else be responsible for that decision? Yeah. And it's just an example, but it happens constantly everywhere.
And I'm going to go a little deeper on what you just kind of hinted at. Like, so let's say a load is paying $2,000, right, to a truck. One carrier might say that's fair, and another carrier might say those rates suck. They're so low.
Yep.
And what's the difference between those two carriers? Well, carrier A, who says that's fair, understands supply and demand, has a well-oiled machine for a company, is financially solid, doesn't have double-digit truck notes, is not up to their eyeballs in debt, and understands how to operate their business efficiently. Broker B, who says that's not enough money, that's too cheap, probably, the same amount of money, but it's not going to go as far with them because of all the other mix-ups that they have in their company that may not be. And I'm not saying every trucking company is like this, but there are trucking companies that complain about price because they have maintenance costs that are not the broker's fault. They have deadhead that is not the broker's fault. We didn't tell you.
Didn't position your truck there.
This load is being offered in Atlanta. Yeah. If you're in Rome, Georgia, if you want a deadhead, have at it. I might give you a little bit, but like, it's not my job to pay you deadhead if there's other trucks available. This is the average rate. Like, there are other factors that are outside of simple broker to carrier rates that are reported on DAT, and it just is what it is. Like, same with brokers, right? Like, our rates are down from what they were in the past too.
Yes.
Right? So we're a margin based business. So when we make, I'll just arbitrarily say 15%. 15% off of what we do today is going to be less of 15% if it was the same business volume 2 years ago. And guess what? We still have to pay all the same stuff. We've got to pay our employees. We've got to pay for, our insurance and our bond and every other, like TMSs don't get cheaper because rates are down. They usually go up every single year. Everything tends to go up every single year.
Yeah, insurance.
But the difference is we have to financially manage our companies in a smart way that we can weather the ups and downs.
Well, let's use an example on the other end of the spectrum that proves the same point, right? Like freight brokerages. Look at a lot of the load matching companies, right, that have gone out of business in the past year. Let's take Surge or any of them, right? That business model requires you to charge less money than your competitors, right? So that you can acquire business. You have less money, profits coming in the door to spend into your business, to pay your employees and to have profits, right? Everything that goes into it. But the reason they were able to do it was because they borrowed large sums of money, right? And leveraged future payments, right? For now, right? They're borrowing millions of dollars so that they could operate with not profits, right? They're literally not profitable, right? And they're able to do that because they borrow a bunch of money because they think that they can catch up to that faster than the market will, right? That's the gamble, right? And you know what? That gamble was wrong, at least right now, and it didn't play out. And that's why those companies also had to go out of business, right? It doesn't just happen to carriers. It happens to all businesses, right?
Netflix operated at a loss for like 10 years before they turned a profit, right?
And exactly. And again, like this is also just human nature, right? Like the saying, be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful, which is like the financial investment advice of
Warren Buffett
for the past 80 years, right?
Yeah.
And it really comes down to something that is very simple to understand, but incredibly difficult to put into practice in business. Because guess what? Every time I look at the market right now and I see that the NASDAQ is at an all-time high, it literally might close 23 at an all-time high. The S&P, Bitcoin, and all these things are surging, right? Everybody sees that and feels fear of loss and wants to jump in because they feel like they're missing it, right? The reality is this is exactly what they're talking about. When things are going well, everybody feels like they're going to go well forever and they keep wanting to jump in until it stops, right? That's every market. And again, it happened to carriers. It also happens to brokers. It happens to every business. The reason the economy has to cycle through that is because if you never have a mistake where there's a repercussion, meaning you don't have to pay for your choices, there's nothing bad happens no matter how many gambles you make, you keep gambling. So like it has to cycle through, and the people that don't win get worked out. The people that make safer decisions sometimes win. Sometimes the people that make big gambles make big payoffs temporarily, right? But this is capitalism. Like this is how all of it works, right? And if you're a fan of our country and how we build it, like you can't be okay with that and not okay with it when some people don't win and you're not happy about it temporarily, because it's part of all of it. You don't just get the upside without any of the risk or any of the downside. There is no return without taking risk ever, no matter what you're doing.
Precisely. So let's, as teased earlier, I want to talk about some actual real world situations. So I will tell you, Steven, you can unmute yourself. What's up? Producer is like waving at me.
I was just you guys were talking about numbers in the market, and the one thing I wanted to point out is I just looked at my numbers over this year compared to last year, and just to display the disparity in the markets, is my load volume is up 66% year over year. My gross revenue on that, not margin revenue, is only up 11%. So that tells you this.
Hold on, define gross revenue. That is your gross profit, right?
No, sales. Gross revenue.
When I'm talking about
your revenue, sales.
That's the money being paid by.
Oh yeah, your accounts receivable. Got it.
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about your profit, which is probably correlates similar as well, unless your margin percentage has increased. But that goes to speak volumes, right? You're moving 2/3 more than you did last year, and that only equates to
11% more dollars.
Increase in dollars coming in the door.
So think about that.
Your company still has to pay for insurance and has to pay for salaries and has to pay for X, Y, and Z, because you're not going to get a discount because the freight market's down.
For sure. But here's also what that points out, right? It shows that the work required to generate the same revenue, right, went up almost 50%, at least some round number, right? Which means the amount of loads you've got to run, invoice, check calls made, every single task a freight brokerage had to do, right, in Steven's example, went up 66%. So if you did 1,000 loads, just for a round number, that means you got to do 1,600 loads this year with the same resources, or pay more people to help move 1,600 loads, and your dollars coming in your door only went up 11%. So you did 600 more loads onto 1,000, right? And your money only went up 11%, right? So what happens with freight brokerages, right, is also the same thing in a down market. They don't try to grow profit. They try to grow market share, which means get more loads for less money. So they're doing more business. And the reason freight brokers do that in a market like this is because they know the market is cyclical. And when it comes back up, they will have more loads that they're working on to be able to start profiting once things pick up. It's not as if like freight brokers are making the same amount of money, to everyone's point, in ups and down markets. They're going through the exact same things. It's just nobody's screaming at shippers and telling it's their fault for not paying us more. because we know it's the supply of the freight in the market and the carriers that are available to move it that actually determine what the rate is to have them move.
I'd actually be curious. You made me think of something there, because a lot of think about your retail goods. A lot of those goods are moved. The accounts are owned by a freight forwarder who then uses a freight broker who then finds a motor carrier, right? Yep. And maybe even a dispatcher is involved in there. How come no one's talking about freight forwarder margins or dispatchers? How much? I mean, they're not as relevant as they were a couple years ago when everybody had their dope logo and dispatching company. But nobody really talks about the other side of it, like the shipper side or the freight forwarder side. How do you know that there's not some smart transportation guy running their department that's oh, we're going to play all these guys against each other, keep driving the price down, drive the price down, right?
That's the game.
And a lot of companies, there is somebody there that
is the game. That's exactly what they're doing, right? Effective shippers, right, use bids to drive rates as far down as they can, right? No company wants to pay to move anything they sell. And Ken's point, right, he said something on here that I think really also helps drive this home. I want to read this one last thing, because somebody asked this question, right? And this makes a lot of sense. They said, define a shipper. And he goes, this is one of the best questions, because shippers, they don't think of themselves as shippers. They're steel producers, retailers, chicken farmers, etc. Industry people like us label them as shippers because that's how we view them, right? Because the reality is,
really,
yes, if you're selling steel, you don't ever want to have to pay a truck anything, because every dollar you pay to move it to get it to your customer is less money you got to keep for selling it. So they're always incentivized to push rates as far down as they can. So even if you get rid of all freight brokers in the middle and there's just motor carriers, and just say for some magical explanation, they could see all the freight from every shipper is going to do this no matter what. If there is less things to move and more carriers to move it, they will push that number until it can't be pushed anymore. And the only reason it can't be pushed anymore is because carriers have to stop accepting whatever that number is. If they keep willing to provide a service for what is being offered, the number will keep going down until nobody will do it anymore, which is why rates stop at a certain point, either up or down. It's the willingness of the people providing it to either do it or not do it that is going to determine where that falls.
Precisely. So I'll give you real world examples of some margins. I'm not going to give too specific. I'll give you rough estimates because I don't want to disclose any private information. But I will tell you, and this has been fairly consistent for the last decade plus that I've been in this industry. It's been in the mid-teens. That's what I've seen. I've seen it fluctuate based on business model. I've seen it fluctuate from customer to customer, but it's been pretty on point with what Ken has said. Now, I will tell you that there have been loads where we've made over 50% margin, but they're $80 or $60 LTL loads, literally, which equates to I don't know, $40 in profit, which is the time. It's not even, we're basically losing money because my time's not worth that. But on paper, it's going to show 50% margin, but it's not truly reflective of the dollar amount.
For sure. I'll give you another example, right? In the early 2017, after the ELDs were probably the largest margins I saw consecutively across my book, right? I was able to average on some accounts, probably high 30s was my average, probably commission percentage. Mm-hmm. Now, that sounds egregious to the carriers, right? But if you look at what we were paying to the carriers, right? The average dray load at that time, I would say in 2016 was probably $350 to $500 for a 25-mile dray, right? Now, into 2017, where my margins went to the high 30s, I was paying carriers 3 to 5 times that for the same work. So I'm paying a motor carrier that all the year before that was making $500 at most for a 25-mile run. I'm paying them $1,500 to $2,000 for the exact same amount of work. I'm charging my customer 40% on top of that because they couldn't find anybody willing to do it at all for them, right?
You bring up a great point, and I want to add this in before we go past it. When I've seen on full truckload, when I've seen big dollar amount rips or margins, it's usually
coming out of the customer's pocket, not the
exactly.
Carrier.
But I'm not the only one making money. That carrier's getting paid a hefty amount as well. And that's the same. We saw that in the peak of the pandemic, and they weren't complaining then, right? When they were making 2X or plus,
Exactly, because it's the same thing. And another example is like a Friday afternoon load that's got to pick up in an area with very few trucks, right? It's got to pick up in the next hour and a half. There's 2 trucks there. You might be normally paying $3,000 for that lane. You might pay that carrier $4,500 to pick up that same load because it can't sit there over the weekend and nobody else is going to take it. But guess what, right? Like my margin, I'm adding on top of what I got to pay that carrier because I don't have a choice. The carrier is the only one that can do it for me. So since it was so hard for me to find that one, my margin gets added and it comes out of the shipper's pocket. It's not coming out of the carrier's pocket, right? Because when you see a market like now, you can't push a carrier much farther than where the market is anyway, right? So you're only getting a percentage or two, even if you get an extra $25 out of them. The real fat margins you see in our industry almost are always in a market where it's really tight. The carriers are doing even better than averages, and the shippers are the ones actually paying those margins.
Exactly. And actually, Steven just typed something in the chat here. I was gonna talk about it myself. Is he said some of the biggest margins that he'll get come from year-long contracts that have big deficits and average in the teens at the end. And that's exactly so. To give you a real-world example, we have customers that have contractual pricing for the entire year because they want even freight spend. They don't care if the market goes up or down. They want theirs to be predictable and all of that. So what does that mean for us as brokers? Some of the time, we might have an average margin, 15% or whatever. Some of the time, we might make a ton of money because the actual cost to get a truck is much lower than that rate. And then there's the other side, which is, hey, trucks are really expensive right now. We're going to take a loss. And that's what I was going to talk about. The biggest losses that I've seen or that the company's taken are typically in that instance. And we're talking like over $1,000 a load for multiple loads being lost. We had some of our most profitable brokerage offices in the company that would operate at like a single-digit margin when they have a lot of profitable freight, but it's being drugged down by all those big losses. And to operate, and I'll just kind of make this up, but let's say you're operating at a 5% margin in a certain month. That is a strain on your cash flow, especially if you're doing millions of dollars a month. But it'll be offset when you're operating at a 25% margin another month, right? So that's the whole thing there is that we act as the bank. We're a normalizer for freight spend for shippers and all of that. The biggest rips I've seen, none of your business, carriers. No, I'm just kidding. We've had loads that made a couple $1,000s, but they're also massive projects where the trucks are getting paid a lot of money. We've got a lot of involvement in this. We have extra insurance we're paying for. We've got to babysit these. Sometimes you have boots on ground, but you can absolutely make a couple $1,000s on a big project load. We had one that went earlier this year that was like extremely overdimensional, extremely overweight, required escorts, all kinds of permits, and the value of the cargo was like $25 million. So we're going like. And the freight invoice was like $60,000. And if we're going to have, if we make 15% on that, do the math, that's like a lot of money for margin. But the reality is there's a lot of time and effort that went into that. And those trucks are getting paid very, very good on that stuff. So
I'll give you one last example.
Those are my stats.
One last example. Again, some of the fattest margins I saw. One of my buddies used to run airplane parts out of Miami to airports around the country. And they were parts that airplanes, when they ground or whatever it is, they land in between their flights and they need something for maintenance and they can't take back off until they get it, right? So just in time, need this as fast as possible. And like I would say average margins were probably 40 to 60% on every load that he ever ran. Yep. And it was all team loads. We overpaid every truck and every team driver and told them, hey, we'll give you the extra 100. This is important. Just you over communicate, let us know what's going on. And here's the reality, right back to there. When I met with that customer and talked to them, I was like, hey, we worked for them for like a year. I was like, out of curiosity, I was like, why do you not necessarily care about the extra 200 or 300, right? It was my buddy's account. We both lived here and we met him in person. And he goes, well, let me show you. And he shows us his invoices, to your point, right? He was bringing these parts in from overseas and things most of the time, right? From wherever their manufacturers were really quickly. And they would make sometimes close to 6 figures on that same shipment, right? So if we shipped landing
just their gear, margin on the part,
their margin, right? On that, call it, a piece of landing gear that was going on a flatbed to, O'Hare Airport. He's like, I'm making $70,000, right? Getting this part to them when they need it, right? He's like, Me paying you $3,000 versus $6,000 isn't significant. What's significant is if they don't want to do business with me again. So I will overpay you guys all day long. I want you to overpay the carriers, and I want everybody to be happy, because if something goes wrong, we lose where we're really making money. And again, that's what a lot of people, I think, don't think is or understand is behind margins in some of these individual transactions a lot of the time.
Yep.
It's not and somebody fighting.
Stuff is just the opposite.
And we all work together.
So the aircraft on ground situation is big because the opportunity cost is massive. They don't get that part, so they're going to pay, like you said, right? The opposite is your low margin stuff, your lumber, your steel, like your raw materials and building materials that can sit there until they find a cheap truck who's willing to haul it for whatever it is.
Yes. Different scenario.
That's just it. So, good discussion, man. Do you have anything else on margins? I feel like I can go on and on and on, but I really want to get Ken on here and talk about it. And hey, Mr. James Lamb. I did want to point this out. He did post something in here and said, we invited him to come on the show. Let me pull up the tweet here. And he said, wait for it. He made some comment about like the youth. Here we go. So he said, I said, again, come on the podcast and let's talk about this unfiltered. You'll get a massive audience and plenty of time to talk. We're recording tomorrow at 9:30 Eastern. Are you open? He replied, aren't we doing Rutherford this morning, Bill? He tagged his buddy. It's either that or the Freight Baby Show. Jim Lamb USA. Some of us have been in trucking for over 30 years. Before you guys were born, you're about to learn a thing or two in a different forum. Stay tuned. We'll be back after these messages. I'm not in my 20s, first of all, so I don't know where. Ben, you're not even in your 30s. But, no. Hey, I got mad respect for people that have been in the industry a long time. I've been in logistics for almost 20 years now, right? And so for someone to say over 30 years, that's cool. But the reality is, good. 20 years for me isn't even relevant because the shit 20 years ago isn't the same as it is if it is today. Like
the things that work.
Like if you were in logistics before COVID, it's different. So like I don't care.
Yeah.
I almost sometimes have to check myself because I'm like, I got to stop thinking that I'm the smartest guy in a conversation because I've been doing it for so long. Because oftentimes I need a fresh set of opinions and thoughts to keep myself, on the straight and narrow in the current market versus back in 2005, blah, blah, blah. So, but yeah.
For sure. Exactly. I don't really have much to add to it, but I would really like to be able to have a forum where we could have somebody openly discuss these things and to see.
Good deal. All right. Well, good discussion, man. Coming up on an hour here. There's a lot of rants and discussion points, and hopefully it's valuable and gives insight. I'm sure our boys over on the trucking side aren't going to listen and really care, but if they are, if you guys know anybody out there, send them our way. We'd love to have an open discussion with anybody and give a platform for those to give their other side. Because the reality is, like I said, we have a bias towards brokerage because this is what we do all day, right? If there's a carrier out there that wants to come in and tell their side of it and open our eyes to a different perspective, by all means, I'd be happy to have that conversation.
I've been doing both all year. I've been selling for a trucking company and for a freight brokerage, right? So I'm not even necessarily biased to either side. The only thing I'm biased towards is the truth, right? And to me, what's frustrating, and Ken pointed this out, was you're doing a disservice to the people you say you're helping, right? You say you're a small business coalition of transportation, but by spreading information that isn't correct, you're not helping your audience. You're hurting them by giving them a false narrative as to what's causing their problems, which guess what ends up as? Them not being able to solve the real things that are creating the problem in the first place, right?
Yep.
So you're literally doing the opposite of what you're saying. And to me, that's frustrating. And we talk about this in a lot of our content strategy for next year. We could do lots of videos that are going to cite lots of arguments and pick lots of things that are, confrontational, that will get lots of people to yell at each other. But at the end of the day, that helps nobody except us. And we didn't get into this business to help each other, just to make money by pissing people off and getting them to fight with each other on the internet. The whole point is to be able to share accurate information so that everybody can benefit, work together, and everybody can win, right? And to me, that's why this gets me fired up. And it also reminds me of why I spend little to no time on Twitter or any of these things in my free time, because Reminds me of that old Jay-Z quote, right? Never argue with an idiot because from a distance you can't tell who is who, right?
That's phenomenal. That's your quote for the day. All right, good deal. Final thoughts.
Whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right.
And until next time, Merry Christmas and go Bills. That wraps up this episode of Freight 360. Check out the show notes for links to anything that we've referenced on this episode. And make sure to visit us online at freight360.net to see our entire library of episodes, videos, blogs, and more.
And make sure to check us out on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel for daily and weekly tips and content. And if you'd like your question answered on the show, fill out the Contact Us form on our site, and we'll see you next week.